Think of medieval megaprojects, and cathedrals will be up there for the sheer size, and the fact they took generations to build. And if you're thinking of the Great Wall of China, you would be partially correct, although it was mainly built after the medieval period. But in terms of speed, scale, cost, and the number of workers used, Edward I's 13th century castle building exploits rank globally as being completely over the top, and truly a mega project by even today's standards. Edward's conquest of Wales included upgrading existing castles, but built 6 from scratch, and represent one of the largest building projects in medieval Europe. The story starts 210 years earlier with the invasion of Britain by the Normans in September the 28th, 1066, where they set up a base in an old abandoned Roman fort at Pevensey, bringing with them some flat-pack fortifications. The Saxons fell to the Norseman invasion, first in the famous battle 2 weeks after the landing, followed by William of Normandy being crowned King of England by Christmas, and 4 years later the complete subjugation of England. Scotland wasn't invaded, but the first attempt to invade Wales was the construction of Chepstow Castle by the Earl of Hereford, William Fitz-Osbern, building the Great Tower, with the rest of the castle following over subsequent centuries. The Earl then went out to terrorise the locals. The Normans did invade Wales in 1081, and by 1094 Wales was supposedly conquered. Well, not really. There was not really the castle building or the lords, or rather opportunistic warlords, to fully occupy the country. The young Welsh prince, Ieutheth ap Cynan, after claiming his right to be Wales's king, fought the Normans, then was betrayed and captured. He went on to escape imprisonment in Chester Castle, after which he rose up another rebellion around 1100, retaking North Wales, and by 1136 Wales was largely liberated, helped in part by 20 years of infighting of the Normans. Henry I did mount an invasion in Wales in 1114, which was an utter failure, and he was also fighting the French, so instead the Normans resorted to contracting out a piecemeal invasion to March's lords. March means border. The Earls of Chester, Shrewsbury, Hereford and Gloucester had the title, and if they behaved, they could have their own laws, markets, tax breaks, and build castles without royal permission. As long as they pressed into Wales, and did not even think about looking east and eyeing up the crown of England. In Pembroke, Henry had his Flemish settlers colonise the area. This is Winston Castle, built by Wizzo, a rare example of a drumkeep in a more standard moat and bailey design. For 120 years, both sides were in regular conflict, with territory being lost and gained and the Welsh occasionally making successful raids into England, and the English gaining a foothold in the south and Pembrokeshire. The biggest troublemaker, or at least one in a long line of rebels, was Llewellyn ap Griffith, or Llewellyn the Last, grandson to Llewellyn the Great, who had unified the princedoms of Wales. Llewellyn was quite happy to have Edward I as his king, as long as the king buggered off and left Wales to its own devices and laws. The semi-autonomous region of Wales was not something Edward liked. Llewellyn's grandfather, Llewellyn the Great, had sided with the rebel lords of England in the First Barons' War, forcing John to sign the Magna Carta, and it ensured alliances with English barons. Llewellyn also made an enemy of Edward by continuing to ally himself with the family of Simon de Montfort, who had led the barons in the civil war against his father, Henry III, and had died in battle against Edward, being carved up brutally by him, by the way. Perhaps the biggest grudge was Llewellyn hadn't come to his coronation in 1272. So, in 1276, war. The problem the English faced was they could invade and conquer the small Welsh armies, but the Welsh could simply slip away into the mountains and forests and carry out guerrilla warfare on long supply chains. And if conquered, they could keep their heads down for a few years and resume the conflict. The other problem was lack of infrastructure, suitable roads for armies. Edward had prepared for ongoing conflict in 1277. His solution, a ring of iron around Welsh fortresses of the Snowdonian Mountains. The first challenge was getting troops from Chester, where he launched attacks into Wales. The route was between the rivers Dee and Clwyd, on the very doorstep of England. It was heavily wooded and marshy and mountainous, making it excellent terrain for the tactics of the Welsh. Edward marched his armies into Wales all of 13 miles, and then stopped. The road to their new base at Flint had the vegetation cleared 200 feet on either side, and he'd recruited nearly 2,000 tradesmen and had them brought to Flint with armed guards, and a huge naval operation first bringing timber to build a castle and then stone. Edward employed the Savoyard engineer James of St. George from Savoy in the French Alps, son of a master mason, bringing with him the very latest fashions in castle design. Flint Castle is unusual in that the keep or Dijon is separate from the battlements, as well as the more standard gatehouse and drawbridge. For concentric defence, there's the multiple barrier of a moat, but that was tidal, and it also allowed for supply by sea, a key design element in all of Edward's castles, given the lack of roads suitable for armies. Under the protection of the castle, Edward eventually established an English colony, walled town. The Stonecaster was most likely complete in 1282, just in time to hold out against another siege by Davyth, brother of Llewellyn. Although in 1298 the castle was torched and abandoned in another siege in yet another rebellion, although later repaired. Edward spent £6,068, 7 shillings and 5 pence creating the fortress and the town, which was a lot of money. Inflation makes it around 6 million today, but this is not particularly helpful. Edward's tax take at the time was around 40,000 a year, so in today's government spending it would be closer to 100 billion, although of course we get way more for our money now. A better clue is how much millionaires and multimillionaires of the day had, and that was around £200–500 a year. And with that wealth, they would also have to run a private army to offer to the king if he was in need. In the same year as Flint was being constructed, Edward moved his troops up another 15 miles, to Ruthlin, with his entourage of builders to fortify the ancient town at the centre of a Welsh county. There was a motte and bailey from 1086. The castle is a more complex affair than Flint. Edward moved in for a period, with his 8th daughter being born in the castle, as it neared completion in 1282. Edward had the River Clwyd straightened and dredged to enable supply ships. The canal constructed under the instructions of the master fossitator, ditch digger William of Boston. The canal took 3 years to complete, during which time 1,000 diggers were employed. The castle has a moat on 3 sides, as well as outer walls, with the river serving as a moat on the 4th side. James of St. George turned his design skills to the fortified colonial town, based on the Bastides of the Gascogne, and had proper town planning to aid in defence. The layout ensured ease of movement for defending troops. There was easy access to the ramparts and towers, with a removable wooden stair in case the wall was breached, enabling the defenders to shoot down with some protection and retreat to the castle. It was considerably more expensive than Flint, although we don't have exact numbers. Edward's 1277 pushed further into Llewellyn's territory, camping in the old castle of the Gangway, originally a Celtic hill fort used right up until the medieval period on the western bank of the River Conway. It's been rebuilt in stone by Henry III a few decades before, but this was destroyed by Llewellyn the Great a generation earlier. These castles and Edward's huge army and supporting navy led to Llewellyn conceding in his War of Independence. This was brought on by Edward raiding Anglesey and stealing the harvest, making life for the rebels difficult, and the peace treaty of Aberconway was signed, which required Llewellyn to give up most of his claims to the land taken by Edward. Edward in turn would recognise Llewellyn as Prince of Wales, and he was able to retain Gwynedd as his much reduced kingdom. But it came with a price. That independence would end with Llewellyn's death. Llewellyn was allowed to marry into English nobility at Worcester Cathedral, with Edward in attendance. Other Welsh princes were not impressed, especially Llewellyn's brother, Dafydd, who had a smaller princedom and who rebelled in 1282. Llewellyn reluctantly joined the rebellion and ended up getting killed in an ambush in Mid-Wales whilst on a diplomatic mission to gain support from other Welsh princes, his head removed and put on show on a spike in London. Dafydd was captured in June 1283, and Edward has him hung, drawn and quartered at Shrewsbury in October. Edward inflicted the same fate on the Scottish rebel William Wallace 22 years later. With the Welsh royal line dead, and Wales close to being completely conquered, his next stop was Conway. Edward bypassed the old castle at Dagaway and built his new fortress and walled town on the western bank of the river. Edward ensured one of the walls of the Royal Welsh Court of Conway were incorporated into the town walls. Conway Castle was a staggeringly expensive project costing £15,000, and it's even more impressive in that it was completed in 5 years, and this would have required thousands of workers and an even larger supply chain. James St. George incorporated the latest building innovations into the project, such as 2 barbicans, and in keeping with all the castles, access to the sea for supply, especially in case of siege, with a postern, a defendable second exit, which allowed access to and from the dock. It was positioned roughly where Telford's suspension bridge is. Building on a rocky outcrop meant sappers could not tunnel under the wall to collapse it in a siege. To assist with building and simply getting tons of rock to the masons, cranes were used, but in Conway, an innovation from Europe, put-log holes were used, literally holes in the masonry, to put a log in, to carry scaffolding, and these formed an external scaffolding like an exterior spiral staircase, or ramp, so building material could easily, and more importantly, be quickly carried up. The other surprising import from the continent, as you would imagine they would be in use prior to the end of the 13th century, was arrow slits, tall ones for longbows and cross-shaped ones for crossbows. There are 142 arrow slits at Conway, with the 1.3 kilometre town wall having 500 arrow slits. James designed the castle for minimal defending forces, just 30 crossbowmen with additional service staff, by creating an inner ward which could be retreated to if the castle was overrun, and hopefully ensuring enough time for relief by boat. The main entrance was a drawbridge and portcullis, and then there was another set of oak doors, a kill zone, and another gatehouse with maculations. Conway was built to be a palace, complete with royal quarters, a private chapel and a balcony garden for the missus, although she died just after the castle was complete, aged 49, brought on in part by giving birth to 15 children. And the finishing touch to the castle? It was entirely whitewashed to make Edward's supremacy even more obvious. During the 1282 rebellion, Edward had 2 additional fronts push up from the south, from Carmarthen, and from the west from Hereford, as well as pushing down through the Snowdonian passes from Conway meeting up at Harlech. It seems that Edward had planned on either hemming in the Gwynedd princes with his castle, or had expected the peace to be broken. It seems the first punitive invasion and the Aberconway Treaty was really a cover for total conquest. With the Welsh largely confined to the mountains, work started on Untitled Castle with an initial workforce of 35 masons, along with carpenters and labourers to secure the site. Within 6 months, the first 15 feet of wall were erected, and over the following 3 years, there was a workforce of 546 labourers, 115 quarriers, 13 blacksmiths, 22 carpenters, and 227 stonemasons, with a monthly cost of £240. By 1289, it was largely complete, along with a fortified town, and cost £8,190. Like the other castles, it had a postern and stairs to the sea and a defendable dock, the sea coming right up to the base of the castle mount, and also having concentric rings at events and a second curtain wall and a dry moat, as well as a third castle wall that has now only partially survived. A variation in design, and it seems James was experimenting with each new project, was incorporating the keep into the barbican. It wasn't a new idea. The gatehouse or barbican was one of the weak spots in a castle design and required extra fortifications, and the keep, of course, and Dijon, likewise, was the last line of defence, so why not incorporate both into a single structure? The castles of Crickeath, although not originally an Edwardian castle, was renovated along with Builth and Aberystwyth. Plans to build Beaumaris Castle were drawn up in 1284, but a combination of every stonemason in England and some of Western Europe being employed in other castle projects, and disruption by Madoc's rebellion in 1294, and more on him in a bit, meant building work did not begin until 1295. From a design point of view, it had James's St. George's finest, aesthetically pleasing and well proportioned, as well as being very defensible. Like the others, it had its own dock and defended walls, as well as a double curtain wall and a moat, the outer wall having its ramparts exposed to crossbow fire from the inner curtain wall if it was ever breached, and any attacker who did make it in would have nowhere to hide. It also had the innovation of latrines that were flushed out with the tides, although a number of design bugs were never worked out. A huge amount of work was undertaken in the first summer, with an average of 1,800 workmen, 450 stonemasons, and 375 quarriers on site. This consumed around £270 a week in wages, and the project rapidly fell into arrears, forcing officials to issue leather tokens instead of paying the workforce with normal coinage. In a letter the following spring, James explained to his employer some of the difficulties and high costs involved. In case you should wonder where so much money could go in a week, we would have you know that we have needed, and shall continue to need, 400 masons, both cutters and layers, together with 2,000 less skilled workmen, 100 carts, 60 wagons, and 30 boats bringing stone and sea coal, as well as 200 quarrymen, 30 smiths, and carpenters for putting in the joists and floorboards and other necessary jobs. All of this takes no account of the garrison, nor of the purchase of materials, of which there will have to be a great quantity. The men's pay has been, and still is, very much in arrears, and we are having the greatest difficulty in keeping them because they have simply nothing to live on. Like all Megaprojects, cost and time overruns were setting in. Work on the castle was slow and hampered by a lack of funds because of Edward's war with Scotland in 1306. Work finally finished in 1330 after Edward's death, although internal buildings were not completed, and it cost £15,000. A royal survey 14 years later estimated a further £684 were needed to be spent to get it fully functional. As part of Edward's 1282 campaign, he moved his forces from Conway to Carnarvon using an old Motte Bailey as a field camp, and starting on the construction of the town walls. The cost for this ballooned to £25,000, although completion of the castle took longer with work coming to an end. 48 years later, in 1330, building work was interrupted when the town and castle were taken and sacked in another rebellion, this time by a relative of Llewellyn Madog, in 1294, who was carried along by Welsh discontent with Edward's English laws, English taxes, and conscription of Welsh bowmen for his wars. An Anglesey prince, he led a force that captures the partly built Carnarvon. Edward, meanwhile, is preparing to battle in France and is forced to take his 21,000 men to recapture the town. Whilst they pause in Conway, Edward, through a series of badly judged decisions, ends up being besieged with a much reduced force in his own castle in the winter of 1295. Bad weather that winter prevented supply, and the bulk of his forces camped out in the old castle across the estuary were unable to help. But by February of 96, the weather had improved and the siege was abandoned, and supplies and troops reached Conway. Madog's rebellion was short-lived, Carnarvon Castle being recaptured in 1295, with the defeat of his rebels. The original vision for the castle was never realised, as internal structures remain only foundations. Its cost and slow building process was in part because this was architecturally complex and symbolic. The town was known as Saguntium, with the remains of a Roman fort visible on the hill overlooking the harbour. It was the supposed base for the Roman governor, Magnus Maximus, who, in the 4th century, proclaimed himself emperor and marched his British garrison to Gaul, where he seized control of the Western Empire for a few years. Welsh princes claimed direct descendants from this noble line, as he was said to have married a local girl, and according to a chronicle of the period, Edward's builders claimed to find the body of Magnus Maximus, which was reburied in a local church. This goes some way in explaining the design of Carnarvon's appearance differing from that of other Edwardian castles through the use of banded coloured stone in the walls and in its polygonal rather than round towers, and the overall theme was to mimic the great Roman walls of Byzantium of the Eastern Roman Empire, which Edward would have seen in his crusades as prince. And the building was also linked to a Welsh legend of Magnus's dream. In his dream, Maximus has seen a fort, the fairest that man has ever saw, within the city at the mouth of a river in a mountainous country and opposite an island. An Arthurian myth and legend had been all the rage for over 100 years, being particularly popular with the French speaking English and the French. Edward, who after all was descended from Norse pirates just 200 years earlier, was in competition with French nobility, who could at least claim ancestry from Franks and Charlemagne, who in turn could legitimately claim descent from Roman nobility, and faced the Welsh, who not only had Roman emperor blood, but also ancient British blood and sovereignty over the land. It seems Edward was obsessed enough to have the famous Round Table at Winchester built in 1275, and his grandson Edward III went on to have Arthurian tournaments and set up an order of Round Table Knights called the Order of the Garter in 1348. Edward was building legitimacy, and he moved his pregnant queen to the half-built castle to give birth to his second son, Edward, proclaimed the Prince of Wales, and symbolically a reborn Arthur, true king of the Britons, a little after which his older brother Alfonso, heir to the throne, died at age 10 at Windsor Castle, which to my mind seems awfully suspicious. The cost to Edward of the conquest of Wales was £25,000 for infantry, £17,000 for cavalry, and another £32,000 for expenses like ships and workers, the total cost being £74,000. The castle building cost between £80,000 and £100,000. 10 times or more than government income, Edward was burning money. Edward's first port of call for money had been Italian bankers, first the Riccardi family, and then the Frescobaldi family in Florence, which became the model of the Iron Bank in Game of Thrones. Edward also taxed the Jews of England, who were the only moneylenders as Christianity forbade the practice of loans with interest. However, by 1275, he had taxed them to the point of little return, so he turned to simply murdering them and seizing their assets, and in 1290 expelled those who were left, and seizing their assets as well as writing off any debts to them, or rather having those debts owed by the barons passed on to the crown. Taxes on leather goods and wool were introduced, and this raised the overall tax take to £50,000 a year. And under the feudal system, Edward could simply conscript workers, goods and materials simply on the promise of paying later, labourers being press-ganged into service and held against their will. People may complain about projects such as HS2 costing $100 billion, about $10 billion a year, but that's only 2% of the total tax take of around $550 billion a year. Over the period of war and castle building, taxes collected were around £350,000, and spending on just the Welsh conquest was between £150,000 and £200,000. Edward was a warlord, spending more of his life at war than at peace, and spending taxes on a permanent state of warfare. He built castles to subdue and dominate the Welsh, yet now they are as much an identity of the country as much as the landscape, with the world's highest density of castles. England's legacy of this period is Parliament. To pay for the war, Edward had to consult or parley with his lords, as well as commoner knights twice a year in the Palace of Westminster to keep them on board with his spending. So, I hope you've enjoyed this tour, and thank you for watching. Hit the like, subscribe, and if you have a favourite castle, do leave a comment.